Hello, welcome to episode 9. I want I want to talk about Little Women for whatever reason. Not the trailer that came out today, or I guess it came out today. I saw it today. But the Little Women that I'm rewriting. I tell people sometimes I'm rewriting Little Women, and I wait for some kind of response. And I don't get response, and I'm wondering, what their actual response is, if they have no response at all. But I do want to talk a bit about why. This is an ongoing project. I've been working on it for a year or so. And so I think sometimes it's good to talk about ongoing projects. Sometimes it's really obnoxious. Talk about ongoing projects. There's a lot of usefulness to it, I think, if you were trying to learn about writing. Hearing somebody talking about an ongoing project can be very useful. Robert Olen Butler had this series of videos about the process of writing. I don't remember what he was writing. And I thought, this can be very useful if I agreed with him on anything. If it wasn't so obnoxious, it would be really useful. So I'll try not to be as obnoxious, even though rewriting Little Women in a way is purposely obnoxious. But there's a good reason for a man to rewrite Little Women. It's kind of an Oulipo challenge. And Oulipo is something I'm fascinated with. As a way to access different parts of the subconscious and what have you. If you're familiar with Oulipo, just the goals of Oulipo. And the Oulipo challenge I came up with was, for many different reasons, but the Oulipo challenge I came up with was to do something that was patently offensive. Aware that it is offensive, which is I wonder why when people don't respond to me when I say I'm rewriting Little Women, I wonder how serious they're taking that particular claim. I have no idea. But to do something patently offensive but pull it off in a way that's not offensive, and then another layer to that is that recognizing that a man rewriting Little Women is patently offensive and then doing it so that it is not that it is inoffensive, but also not drowning it in political allegory or anything like that. To not make anyone allegorical. And I talked about this in my last video. Something like Mother. What weakens Mother is she's standing in for Mother Earth, and it turns the mother character into this vague, overly broad sort of non-entity because it's so carefully about Mother Earth and what have you. It sort of gets drowned in the allegory. So it's a way of exploring on so many different levels how to really effectively do a character. I don't know if I'm doing it well or not, but who knows? Who knows if I'm actually succeeding? However, that's sort of the challenge. But part of the challenge was to create really compelling characters, not technically based on Little Women. Siku. Not technically based on Little Women, just calling it Little Women. All the characters being female, all of them being complicated, none of them being overly, all of them having nuance and flaws, none of them being, overly good for the sake of being this allegorically good character, something that sort of, weakens Mother, for example, as a character. But part of the way to go about that has to do with subjects and objects, which is, I think, the object lesson to learn. No pun intended. The object lesson to learn from this idea of characters as subjects and objects, and meditating on subjects and objects is partly where the Rainbow Circle came from. Here's where the title of the show comes from. The center of the Rainbow Circle. But it was partly a frustration of, the people presenting concepts of storytelling that I disagreed with. Where, for example, they would prioritize things like realism. So, the most significant, according to this worldview, the most significant value is reality, and everything is subordinated under that. The most pure storytelling is reality, and everything is subordinated under that, which is nonsense, because that turns all imaginative things into allegories that are just standing in for reality, and it's very limiting to the imagination. But if you, this is just a process that I went through, meditating on what you could actually subordinate, what is subordinated, what you could most effectively subordinate under something else, and how do you get down to the core. So it's not the imagination subordinated to reality. It's actually the other way around. In storytelling, it's the other way around. So down at the core is what you might call the soul, the subject, the humanity, the visceral abstraction, as I would call it. It's not physical reality necessarily. It is abstraction technically, but it's visceral abstraction. So if you think of abstract expressionism, that's a different kind of abstraction than science and math, for example. That's what I would call cerebral abstraction. And so the deeper down you get, the more this is where it gets kind of tricky to wrap your head around. But the deeper down you get, the more non-dualistic you get. So the most ultimately subjective core of humanity is at the same time the most objective. The melding, the black hole core melding of subjectivity and objectivity. But the farther away from that core you get, the more you get hierarchies and subordinations for the sake of social structures and things like that. And so the most basic dynamic of subjects and objects is that a subject is able to make decisions, is able to think for himself or herself, is able to act freely. And when the system outside of them doesn't allow them to act freely, they still have the desire to act freely, or they still have a rich inner life that gives them the dreams to act freely. But an object is just a tool, so an object is just used by the subject, or it functions for the sake of the subject. And so, when writing a character of any kind, to give them a real rich, vicarious, visceral, give the audience a really rich, vicarious, visceral experience, the most effective thing to do is to make the character a subject, make them as free as possible. And part of the tricky thing with that is that a character who is an ultimate subject makes their decisions on their own. So even apart from the writer, so the writer can't. That's the tricky thing to deal with. Is the writer can't force the character, can't force the character to be an object, can't force the character to be a tool for advancing the story or what have you, or it comes off as artificial. Not in all cases, not in every single character. There's very little that you can say is always universally objectively true. But That's the negotiation when it comes to creating a character. The really rich, engaging character is the subject with the ability to choose, the ability to act for himself or for herself, without necessarily functioning solely for someone else's as someone else's tool. And so that is one of the classic flaws of men writing female characters. Just no matter how they manifest. So in just the on the surface, the offensive idea of a man rewriting Little Women, the expectation, just is why I wonder how people actually react. I have no idea. But the expected reaction is that it's going to be exploitative, and I would turn them all into objects. And part of the extra challenge, I put all of these harnesses on myself in order to I put the cage around myself to escape it. Makes the challenge interesting for so many reasons. But one of the challenges is that the Little Women, the 4 Little Women characters, are objects in a sense. There are these. I make these little sculptures. I started out doing these videos about collage, about making Boyd sculptures. I call these Boyd sculptures for whatever reason. I don't know. Just little paper mache characters. This is Meg. She has a little bell sound, if you can hear it. This is Amy. This is This is Joe. I went back and forth with which one was which, actually. This is Beth. And they're just named after the Little Women. They have some basic similarities. But they're not, actually don't have all that much in common with the Little Women, really. But the whole idea was to not only challenge myself, really, just to make this remake this well-known novel with well-known characters. The challenge of the superficially offensive concept of a man rewriting Little Women. Furthermore, to turn them into objects. How do I do that and still make them interesting, compelling characters? And there are human characters in the story, too. They're all female characters. That was part of the challenge. And that loses something a bit, because part of the dynamic is, in that complexity, is the interaction of female characters with males in a world run by males, and there's no males in the story at all. So, some of that's kind of lost, but that's that's part of the Ouipo challenge that I gave myself. But part of the inspiration is actually, I just happen to have this right here, Wizard of Oz. This is Marvelous Land of Oz, which is a book that that I teach a couple of semesters every year. But I think part of the L. Frank Baum went into writing that with very particularly a feminist agenda, to write a positive female role model. And Dorothy has become this really compelling, fascinating character. And one of my favorite characters, one of the most fascinating, compelling characters of all time. And so there's a lot you can learn from just looking at her as a character. And part of the challenge of that L. Frank Baum overcomes is that if you start from the perspective of writing a character who is a positive female role model, it's sort of the same challenge that Like with Mother, there was a lot of potential for that to work well, and just subjectively, I didn't think it worked well at all, but there's a lot of potential for that to work well. But it was him strung by the allegorical nature of it, sort of overshadowing everything else. And so a character like Dorothy, who starts off from the intention of, highly influenced by first wave feminism, with the intention of being this strong female role model for girls, having all of these positive traits, that could easily flatten out the character. And Dorothy is a static character. And she's a character that I use quite frequently to talk about how a static character is not necessarily a bad character. Dorothy's one of the great characters in literature, and she's a very dynamic character in many ways, but she doesn't change and she doesn't learn lessons. But what makes her really compelling, there are many things that make her really compelling. What makes her really compelling and what keeps her from flattening out and just turning into a flat tight, it is that her subject to it, her ability to make decisions, her ability to solve problems, her ability to act as an individual human being without being subordinated to anyone else. There are times when she is acting on orders, but ultimately she has a goal, and her goal is really textured. Her goal is to, in the book version at least, her goal is to get back to her Aunt Em, because she believes she's the only source of happiness for her Aunt Em, whose life has been, obliterated by hard work and everything. And she brings her happiness to her Aunt Em. And that's her goal, is to bring happiness to her Aunt Em, and she thinks that her Aunt Em's going to be sad. So she encounters these deadly obstacles, and she is able to overcome them, and she remains subject. And you have that paradoxical, she's ultimately good, but she's also flawed in the sense that she's so monomaniacally focused on her goal that she comes off as cold. So she's so compassionate and warm on the one hand, but she's also cold and almost sociopathic on the other hand. She's very rich in texture, sort of a character. But it's her subject to it. And so if you compare that to, and I said in the last video I talked about how the witches, that's something that I tend to talk about, and frame it in terms of just a history of negative female stereotypes. But the Wicked Witch of the West, for example, to a degree, part of the problem with the stereotype is the objecthood. They're objects of derision, and they're objects of just fear. They're not allowed to be their own people, witches historically are rejects from society and turned into objects, not allowed to be subjects, with a whole complex of decisions. And to a degree, the Wicked Witch of the West is a flat villain. But what's really compelling about her in the book version is the similarity she has with the wizard. The wizard makes people think that he has power. And it's really just fooling people into having that he has power. What's really compelling about the Wicked Witch of the West is she's doing the same thing, and she's ultimately a really terrified character. And she's really vulnerable and weak, and she's maintaining the illusion of power. So she's actually, this fascinating, compelling, nuanced sort of character in the book. Even though, certainly to a degree she still functions as a stereotype. Um, but, that's sort of the influence, is just looking at characters that, like, not as obvious in terms of what they do. They don't take the easy road. L. Frank Baum does not take the easy road to make them interesting characters. All of these different aspects of characters, like Dorothy and like the Wicked Witch, shouldn't really work based on a lot of conventional wisdom about how characters really work. Conventional wisdom, most of the conventional wisdom being nonsense, basically. But a lot of the conventional wisdom about how these characters should work, just superficially is not there. Dorothy's a static character. She doesn't learn anything. The Wicked Witch of the West is a stereotype in many ways. But what makes them really compelling is their subjecthood and their paradoxes, which I talked about before. The conflict between how they present themselves and the essentially the opposite motivation functioning simultaneously. Those are the aspects of the character that really work and make them compelling, even though all these other aspects make them not really work. So I don't know that L. Frank Baum presented this to himself as a challenge necessarily, but on one level, they are things that, as a writer, you don't give yourself those qualities of a character to make writing really compelling characters easy. And I've done that with Witches too, which is no pun intended. I've done that with Witches too. This is part of a book I'm working on called Murder Birds, where there's a lot of nested stories, but one of the nested stories is about witch nuns. So I just started off saying, if I wrote a witch character, how do I really make the witch characters really interesting and compelling? And making them subjects, making them nuanced and flawed and capable of making their own decisions, making them exist within the story, not for the sake of the story, to advance the story. And that's another story where there's not a whole lot of male characters. There's male characters to a degree driving parts of the plot, but it's the male characters function more as objects than the female characters. But for the witch nuns, for example, in that book, they don't function as objects. They function as, characters with their own motivations, with their own drives, and what have you. And so that's part of the challenge that I presented myself with the Little Women, who are sitting over here on the shelf. There they are. Part of the challenge that I presented myself. Just as a starting point, and they're all objects to a degree. They're these tiny, little, having a different meaning there, but there are these tiny little creatures called voids. But each one of them has an individual motivation. They're not... they appear superficially as objects, but they're not actually objects. They each have, this is what I'm aiming for. I don't know if I pulled it off perfectly, but this is what I'm aiming for. They each have individual motivations, but they also have qualities that are the opposite. So, Meg is the responsible leader of the family. Vague similarities to the book, and intentionally, little echoes here and there of the book, but not based on the book, really. But Meg is the leader, but she also has, the Boyds have been persecuted by, these other monsters and what have you, eaten and destroyed. And so she's responsible and kind and caring to her family, but she's also at the same time, she has these megalomaniacal revolutionary tendencies. And so balancing those two, making those two qualities of her really work together. Jo has, the really imaginative one and imagines herself to be a hero, but she's also really delusional. She has delusions of grandeur. And I might have mentioned how much I love... Oop, hold on. There you go. This bow. I was wondering when the animals would get involved. Where are the rest of the animals? Where was I? Oh yeah, so I mentioned my love of Don Quixote and The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. She has more to do with that kind of character than the actual Jo from the book, but and Beth is vague echoes and references to the book, but she knows she's bound to die, so she tries to kill herself and she fails, but she really wants attention at the same time, so she's she's got those two different qualities to her. Amy, I need to develop a little bit more, but she's an inventor, and just coincidentally, I have a character named Greta Stromack who was influenced by Greta Gerwig. The original idea was, what if Greta Gerwig was in a Miranda July movie, and then mix her with Tammy Stronach from Neverending Story, and that sort of became Greta Stromack. But she's an inventor, and a lot of them there are human characters, and the Boyds are reflecting them in different ways, but Greta's an inventor, but she's also always praying to heaven for heavenly intervention. Which, those two qualities don't really seem to fit together. But, and here's where the subjecthood comes in. I don't know. I mean, that's the original generation of the idea was just, what if Greta Gerwig was in a Miranda July movie? And then Greta the character just told me, basically, I'm an inventor, I pray to heaven for heavenly intervention, and it's phrased like that too. She doesn't pray to God, she prays to heaven for heavenly intervention. I don't know, I didn't come up with that, she came up with that. She collects blue dinosaurs for some reason. I don't know. I don't know where that came from. It didn't come from me. But if you grant a character subjecthood and the ability to make their own decisions, it will, it enhances the engagement with the character. Not that it's more realistic, and that's, as I said, that tends to be falsely placed as the superior quality. But it's more viscerally engaging when they have that subjecthood and that humanity on the level of the visceral abstract. So, my handy dandy rainbow circle. So the center is the visceral impact, the visceral engagement. The churning cauldron of non-dualistic emotions of the character, all of the different contradictions and feelings and intensities of the character, or whatever. And then right in the center of all of that, so one, two, three, four. Right in the center of all that, you have that level of realism, and that's sort of the barrier between the two types of abstraction. One type of abstraction is, like I said, the visceral abstraction, that's sort of like abstract expressionists, the free-flowing emotions, the uncontrolled emotions, free of cerebral restrictions and what have you. And on the other side of that barrier is the cerebral abstraction, which is designed ultimately to decrease the visceral impact, to gain a greater understanding, to create, these hierarchies and these universals, in order to increase, rational understanding and control, and to turn things into objects. So when you have a hierarchy, you're constantly subordinating things over whatever is at the top of that. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy is the only one granted subjecthood. So, and you have stories where the characters are scaffolded like that, where you have, the central character, and every other character functions as an object supporting that central character, and that can work just fine. I'm not saying that that's a total failure, as long as you have one character at least with some kind of subjecthood. But in a truly hierarchical structure, really only the top is granted subjecthood, and everything else is given objecthood. And traditionally, that's how, that's one of the major problems with the female characters, is that the central character would be a male, and the female characters would be objects that function as tools for that male character, on whatever level, as enemies, as sexual objects, and what have you. But, that's traditionally, the real problematic way of dealing with the female characters. But to make all of the characters engaging, to make the characters throughout the text engaging. So if you think of Dorothy and the Wicked Witch, for example, Baum could have easily just made Dorothy really compelling, and then made everybody else an object. That whole series, that's the first book, Wonderful Wizard of Oz, but the whole series a lot of it is about objecthood. If you think of the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, he could have made them all objects who are unaware of their subjecthood, or have no subjecthood. But it is about, the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, at least, is about a character, the central character is she's self-actualized from the beginning. She's not learning anything, really. She's teaching others how to self-actualize. But has embraced her subjecthood, and she's encountering all these characters who think that they're objects, basically, and they desire subjecthood, and she's giving it to them, basically. And so you have a really compelling story where, the central character has subjecthood, and she's encountering, how many characters really have subjecthood in that whole story. The four main characters, certainly, arguably the Wizard and the Wicked Witch of the West, arguably, they all have subjecthood. So it makes this really compelling, complex. It's a kid's story, but it's a very complex kid's story. Makes this very complex kid's story that's, infinitely rereadable, if you ask me. In comparison to the 39 movie, and the 39 movie is magnificent. And a lot of the value of that is the performances by Judy Garland and Margaret Hamilton. A lot of that makes it really compelling. But the biggest problem with that is that movie, arguably, is the ending, where, Dorothy throughout the movie has a lot of the qualities of Dorothy in the book. A lot of the time she's able to make her own decisions, she solves problems, she guides others and functions as a leader, she teaches subjecthood to a degree, not quite as much as in the book. But by the end, laying on the bed, surrounded by men, she gives up on her autonomy. She gives up on her subjecthood. She says, and that's part of the problem with learning lessons as being the ultimate goal of stories. learning lessons, learning a lesson at the end of a story is the end of the story. It's not the point of the story, and that's a big problem. That's a big mistake that a lot of people make. Is Dorothy learning that there's no place like home. That's resolution of the tension of the story, but that's not the value of the story. The value of the story is Dorothy's humanity. Her learning, her becoming subject to this abstraction, her becoming an object of this abstraction, her becoming less human, essentially, by subordinating herself to this greater concept, resolves the tension and ends the story, but it's not the value of the story, it's just the end of the story. But again, she's laying in the bed. She says she's never going to leave home again. She's never going to go on any adventures again. It closes down all of the tension. It essentially dismisses the delight of the fantasy of the rest of the movie. And it's tragic in many ways. I mean, it creates a once you recognize how tragic it is, it creates this compelling, dark, tragic story. I mentioned Tess of the D'Urbervilles before. Not quite as dark and tragic as that one, but similar in a sense that, Tess is this bright young woman with lots of potential who gets crapped on constantly. And so Dorothy, it has fantastic potential, and she's this great adventurer, and she's this great leader. And by the end, she says, I'll never go on an adventure again. It's tragic for so many reasons, but it's tragic because she's dismissing her imagination. She's dismissing the possibility of adventure. And she's dismissing her subjecthood. She's dismissing her leadership. She's dismissing all these different things. So it's a very dark, tragic ending. But, just the movie itself is still really compelling and engaging, and I mentioned the duration of simulation. It holds up. It's able to still bring delight decades later. For the book, it's over a century later. For the movie, it's many, many decades later. But maybe that's all I need to say for today. I'm sure as I progress in writing Little Women, I might have more to say about that. It's kind of a complex story to talk about because there are as I mentioned, the characters take over. Sometimes when the writers talk about that, they sound like crazy people, which is not something I'm ashamed of. That particular kind of crazy. But yeah, I mean, once you grant a character subjecthood, they're going to make their own decisions. So in this story, it just kept growing with dozens of characters making their own decisions. So I'm not sure quite where it's going to go. So I might have more to say about that. And I mentioned another story. I'm That Kid in the Corner was another story that's still ongoing. Not sure where that one's going to go, really. I have some vague ideas, but if the characters don't want to go, I have an idea of the ending. If the characters don't want to go there, I'm not going to force them to go there. But, that's just a lot of that sort of perspective on planning the story is individualistic. I mean, the Oulipo techniques, that's highly individualistic. I would never say. And this is the problem I encounter a lot with, like, writing classes and writing books, is people come up with a technique that works for them, and they say, this is how you should write a story. That's just not true. That's how I individually write a story. But, so I'm not willing to say everybody should just let the story pan out the way the characters see fit, as long as you grant the character subjecthood and allow them to make their own decisions and allow them to have some vitality and soul and what have you. And you have a plan that actually works for the character. The character's willing to go through this plan you set up for him. Feel free to plan as much as you want to. The planning or not planning is ultimately irrelevant as long as it works. But the key is granting the character the ability, the soul to make their own decisions and breathe life into themselves in whatever way they see fit. And so it's delving into the subconscious. So it's not necessarily that you're creating these characters who necessarily have their own life. It's drawing things out of your subconscious without restricting them with overt control, so that it strips the life from them. And so and a lot of people will call that. I sometimes slip into calling it artificial. That's one of the ways it feels. It feels artificial when you're forcing a character to do something against their will. It feels artificial. Artificial sort of takes for granted that reality is the prime value, which I dismiss. But that's the feeling. The feeling of artificiality when you're forcing a character to do something against their will. But soullessness, I think, is a better way of thinking of it. So you take a character with a soul and force them within a structure that doesn't quite work for them. It has the capacity to strip them of their free soul. But that being said, I will wrap it up and see you next time for episode 10.